I walked into the cabin with the mask tucked under my arm, my breath fogging up in the chilly air. The smell of pine and damp wood filled my nostrils as I looked around the small, secluded place tucked deep in the Pocono Mountains. It wasn't much. A single room with a fireplace, some old furniture, a small kitchen area, and a rickety staircase leading to a loft. It was meant to be the perfect getaway. Quiet, peaceful, and far away from the noise of the city. But as I set my bag down and placed the face mask on the table, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling crawling at the back of my mind. I wasn't sure what had made me buy it. The mask had been in a dusty shop I'd stumbled across on my drive into the mountains. It looked ancient, its surface cracked and worn, like it had been around for decades, maybe even centuries. It was painted in hues of red, black, and gold, but there was something off about it. The eyes were hollow, too deep, too lifelike. Something about it tugged at me, and I felt an odd compulsion to pick it up. The shopkeeper had looked at me strangely when I paid for it, but I'd shrugged it off. Now, standing in the cabin, I regretted my decision. The mask felt wrong, heavy in a way that made my shoulders tense. But I pushed the thought aside. It was just a mask, after all. The first night was uneventful. I unpacked my things and started a fire. The crackling flames filled the space with warmth, and the only sounds were the occasional creak of the cabin and the wind outside. I sat by the fire, reading a book for a while before drifting off to sleep. There was something comforting about the isolation, the way the world seemed to fall away with each passing hour. But when I woke up in the middle of the night, something was different. It wasn't anything I could point to immediately, but I felt a shift in the air. The room seemed colder. The fire was just a few embers, barely glowing. The mask, which I had left on the table, was no longer where I had placed it. It was sitting on the chair by the window. I told myself it was just my imagination. Maybe I had moved it without realizing. I got up, picked it up, and placed it back on the table. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing faint sounds, scratching, shifting, coming from the corners of the room. The next morning, I went about my day, trying to ignore the odd feeling in my chest. I went hiking, explored the area, and tried to convince myself that it was just the isolation playing tricks on me. When I returned to the cabin, I noticed that the mask was on the chair again. This time, my heart skipped a beat. I hadn't touched it since I placed it on the table that morning. I walked over to it, half expecting to see something new, but nothing was different. I picked it up again, carefully inspecting it. There was no obvious reason why it kept moving on its own, but the sensation of being watched grew stronger with each passing moment. That night, I locked the doors and windows, something I hadn't bothered to do before. The noises that night were worse. It wasn't just scratching now. It was a dragging sound, like something heavy moving across the floor. I lay in bed, my heart pounding in my chest, as I stared at the ceiling. The sound stopped suddenly, and then there was a soft thud. It sounded like something, or someone, had jumped down from the loft. I froze. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours before I finally summoned the courage to get up. I grabbed a flashlight and crept down the stairs, holding the beam steady. The living room was empty. There was no sign of anything out of place. The mask was back on the table, right where I had left it. I shook my head, chalking it up to stress and exhaustion. I went back to bed, but sleep was elusive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was in the cabin with me. The next day, I took the mask with me when I went out. I couldn't stand the thought of leaving it behind. The whole day was a blur as I tried to distract myself from the unease creeping into my thoughts. But when I returned to the cabin that evening, the mask was on the chair once more. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. The scratching was louder, now accompanied by faint whispering, like a child calling for help. I heard the sounds come from the corner of the room, near the window, but when I turned the flashlight toward it, there was nothing. I jumped when something touched my shoulder. Whipping around, I found only the emptiness of the cabin behind me. My skin crawled as I sat there, wide awake, the mask staring at me from the table, its hollow eyes following every movement I made. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't leave the cabin fast enough. The sense of being followed was overwhelming. I kept seeing movement out of the corner of my eye, flickers of shadows that disappeared when I looked directly at them. The mask was always there, no matter where I moved it. I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself that I was imagining things, but it was impossible to deny what was happening. Then came the night I couldn't explain away anymore. I had been sitting by the fire when I heard the sound. A faint, high-pitched voice, almost like a child's giggle, echoed through the cabin. I stood up, heart hammering in my chest. The room was dark, save for the firelight, but the voice was unmistakable. It sounded like it was coming from the corner, where the mask sat. I approached it, my breath shallow, and as I reached the table, the mask seemed to move. It was slight, almost imperceptible, but I saw it. The angle of the mask had shifted, just enough for me to notice. I grabbed it, ready to throw it out of the cabin, but then I froze. A reflection caught my eye. In the glass of the window, I saw a figure standing behind me. A boy. His face was pale, almost sickly, with dark eyes staring at me through the mask. I spun around, but there was nothing there. I looked back at the reflection, but the boy was gone. The cabin felt colder than ever. Couldn't breathe. The walls seemed to close in around me, and the faint whispering started again, louder now. I backed away, stumbling over the furniture as I scrambled toward the door. But as I reached for the handle, I stopped. The boy's voice filled my ears, clear now, almost like he was standing right beside me. "Don't leave." I yanked open the door and ran out into the night. The cold air hit my face like a slap, but I didn't stop. I ran until my lungs burned, until the fear was replaced with nothing but exhaustion. I collapsed in the snow, breathing heavily, my mind reeling. I didn't go back to the cabin that night or the next. I found a nearby motel and stayed there until I couldn't bear the thought of staying any longer. But the mask, I couldn't forget about the mask. It was still in the cabin, and part of me knew, deep down, that it would never leave me alone. Weeks later, I returned to the cabin with a friend to help me clean up. It was a mess of dust and disarray, but the atmosphere was different, quiet. The mask was still there, sitting on the table, just as it had been when I first arrived. But when I touched it, something shifted inside me. I knew it was time to leave it behind, to rid myself of it. I packed it up and threw it in the back of my car. I drove far from the cabin, deeper into the mountains, and I buried it. It wasn't much, just a shallow grave in the snow, but I didn't care. I needed to put it to rest. When I returned to the cabin, it felt different, peaceful almost. The air didn't feel thick anymore, and the whispers had stopped. I stayed for another night, and for the first time since I'd arrived, I slept soundly. As I left the next morning, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of closure. The mask was gone. The boy was gone. And though I would never fully understand what had happened, I knew one thing. Some things are better left untouched. It was supposed to be the fresh start we needed. A change of scenery, a place to escape the noise and stress of the city. We had just sold our old house, packed up our lives, and were ready to put down roots somewhere quiet, somewhere peaceful. We found it in that cabin, out in the woods, tucked far enough from civilization that we couldn't hear the hum of the highway or the constant chatter of city life. It was perfect. The wooden cabin had a rough yet homey charm. The kind of place where you imagine evenings by the fire, good books, and the smell of pine trees filling the air. But we didn't know about its history. Nobody told us. We didn't ask either. The house had been vacant for a year, which should have been our first warning. The real estate agent, an older woman who looked like she had no patience for small talk, didn't mention why it was empty. She just smiled and handed us the keys, telling us the place was priced to sell. "You'll love it here," she said, her voice soft, but flat, like she wasn't really trying to convince us. We didn't think much of it. The price was good, and it was exactly what we were looking for. A small house with just enough room for us, my wife, Sarah, our 2 kids, Emma and Danny, and our dog, Max. We were ready to settle in. The first week was blissful. We unpacked, organized, and explored the surrounding woods. The kids played outside while Sarah and I cleaned up inside, making it feel more like home. The cabin wasn't new, but it had an old-world charm. The wooden floors creaked as we walked, and the large fireplace in the living room became the focal point of our evenings. We didn't notice anything strange at first, just the usual settling sounds of an old house. It was the second week when the weirdness started. I was the first to notice it. I woke up one morning feeling off. My head was heavy, like I hadn't slept at all, and my stomach churned with a sense of unease. I thought it was just nerves. Moving to a new place can do that to a person. But when I walked down the stairs, I saw it. The smell. It hit me first, sickly sweet, like something rotting. Not the fresh, pine-scented air you'd expect from a cabin in the woods. It was worse than that. The air felt thick, almost suffocating. I looked around the room. Everything seemed normal, but the smell was so strong it made my stomach flip. I went to open the windows to let some fresh air in, but the smell didn't go away. It lingered, hanging in the air like a heavy fog. "Sarah," I called, my voice tight. She came down the stairs in her robe, her eyes bleary from sleep. "What's wrong? Do you smell that?" She wrinkled her nose. "Yeah, it smells like something's rotting." We both stood there for a moment, trying to figure out where it was coming from. The house had a cellar, but I hadn't been down there yet. I didn't want to go alone, so I asked Sarah to come with me. We grabbed a flashlight and made our way down the stairs. The cellar was damp, with concrete walls and a dirt floor. It wasn't much to look at, just old shelves full of dusty jars and what looked like spare parts. There was nothing that could explain the smell. We poked around for a few minutes, but found nothing unusual. No dead animals, no decaying food, just the usual junk you'd expect in a place like that. We figured it was some weird smell from the house settling. Maybe it had been closed up for too long, and the air was just stale. We didn't think much of it after that, but it didn't go away. The smell seemed to come and go, always when we least expected it. Sometimes it would be strong, filling the entire room. Other times just a faint whisper of something unpleasant. It wasn't constant, but it was always there, lurking in the background. That's when the cold spots started. At first, it was just one or two places, right in the middle of the living room or by the door to the kitchen. Places where you'd expect to feel the warmth of the house. But you didn't. Instead, it was like standing in the shade on a cold day. The air would feel different, heavy, almost wrong. I tried to chalk it up to drafts. Maybe there were gaps in the walls or around the windows, though I didn't notice anything obvious. But the more I checked, the more I couldn't explain it. These cold spots would appear out of nowhere, and I couldn't seem to get rid of them. Then the noises started. It wasn't the usual house sounds, the creaks and groans of a building settling. These were different. The first time it happened, I thought it was just my imagination. I had just finished dinner and was sitting in the living room when I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, like someone walking around upstairs. The only problem was nobody was upstairs. Sarah and the kids were downstairs with me, and Max was laying by the fire, snoring. I stood up and checked. There was nothing, no one, but the sound didn't stop. I heard it again, this time from the attic. It was like someone was pacing up there, walking back and forth. I climbed up to check, but when I opened the door to the attic, I was hit with a blast of cold air. The space was empty, just insulation and old rafters, the smell of dust and old wood. I didn't tell Sarah right away. I didn't want to scare her, but the noises kept coming. Sometimes at night, I'd hear tapping on the windows or scratching, like something was trying to get inside. Max started acting strange too. He'd growl at nothing, his ears back, staring at empty corners of the room as if something invisible was there. His behavior made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I didn't want to admit it, but something about this place felt off. I started to question everything. Was it the house? The history of it? I had heard rumors from the neighbors, whispers about the previous occupants. Apparently, a family had lived there before us. But something bad had happened, something awful that no one would talk about openly. I didn't know the details, but I couldn't ignore the odd sense of unease that kept creeping in. It was like the house itself was alive, breathing, shifting around us. I couldn't explain it. One night, after another long day of strange occurrences, I sat in the living room alone. The kids were in bed. Sarah was downstairs in the kitchen. The fire was crackling softly in the fireplace. That was when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just the shadows playing tricks on me. But then it happened again. A chair moved. It slid across the floor, slowly, deliberately, like someone had pushed it. I stood up, heart pounding in my chest. I walked over and looked at the chair, but it was empty. There was no sign of anyone, no explanation. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house was cold, despite the fire. The silence was deafening. I kept hearing the scraping sound of furniture, like someone was rearranging it in the dark. My mind raced. Maybe it was the stress. Maybe I was just tired. But then I heard it. A voice. It wasn't clear at first, but it sounded like someone whispering. The voice seemed to come from everywhere, surrounding me. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone. It was cold. The kind of voice you hear in your nightmares. That was the breaking point. I couldn't take it anymore. The next morning, I called the real estate agent and asked her about the history of the house. She didn't say much, but I could tell she knew exactly what I was asking. She told me that the previous owners had died in the house, the whole family brutally murdered. The police had never caught the killer. I didn't know how to feel. We'd moved into a house with a dark, violent past. And now it seemed like the house wanted us to know it. The smell, the cold spots, the voices, it was all tied to that history. I don't know what happened next. Maybe it was the weight of the history that drove us to leave. Maybe it was the fear, but we packed up everything and left. It felt like we were running, like the house was chasing us. We found another place, far away from there. We never spoke of it again. I don't know what haunted that cabin. Maybe it was the spirits of the family that had died there. Or maybe it was something else, something in the very walls of the house itself. All I know is that once we left, things settled down. The strange occurrences stopped, and I finally felt like I could breathe again. But every now and then, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the scraping of furniture. I can still smell that sickly sweet odor. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I hear the whispers again. They're faint now, just barely there. But I know they're still waiting. And I know, deep down, that house will always be with me. I moved to Westfield with my family just a couple of months ago. We had been searching for the perfect house for years, and when we finally found it, a big, old place that needed some love, but had the kind of charm you couldn't fake. We knew it was the one. It had a wide porch that wrapped around the front, big windows that let in the sunlight, and an overgrown garden that felt like something out of a book. Sure, it needed some work. The floors creaked when you walked on them, the wallpaper was peeling, and the kitchen could use a serious update, but it was perfect. Felt like home. We had been settled in for about 3 weeks when the first letter came. It was a Saturday morning. The sun was just coming up, and the house felt quiet, like it always does in those first few moments of the day before everything wakes up. I was making coffee, the scent of it filling the kitchen, when my son, Matt, came in holding something in his hand. "Mom, what's this?" he asked, showing me a small envelope with no return address. I looked at it for a second. It was just a plain white envelope, the kind you get when you order something online. I took it from him, half expecting it to be a piece of junk mail or some kind of advertisement, maybe a coupon for something local. But when I opened it, there was a note inside, handwritten in thick, dark letters. "I am the Watcher. I have been watching you. I know who you are and I know what you are doing. I am watching your every move. Do not try to leave. The house is mine." My stomach dropped when I read it. I couldn't breathe for a second. I reread the note several times, trying to make sense of it, but the words were still there, the message still clear. The Watcher. "What's wrong, Mom?" Matt asked, his voice cutting through my shock. I didn't know what to say. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. "Nothing, sweetie. It's nothing. Go sit with your sister. Okay? I didn't want him to see how much the letter was affecting me, but I was terrified. I wanted to rip it up and throw it away, pretend it was a joke, some kind of sick prank. But it didn't feel like a joke. The letter didn't make any sense. We had only just moved in. Who would even know we were here, let alone be watching us? I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, was out there, maybe in the woods that bordered the back of the property, just waiting for us to slip up. I folded the letter carefully and tucked it into my pocket, trying to act normal. But inside, I felt a panic rising. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? That someone had sent me a creepy letter claiming to be watching us? It seemed ridiculous. There was no proof of anything, no evidence, no reason to believe it was anything more than some sick person trying to mess with us. But then the second letter came. This time it was addressed to my husband, Ben. Came on a Monday morning while he was at work, and I was home with the kids. Matt and Emma were upstairs playing video games, and I was in the kitchen when the mail came. I didn't think much of it until I saw the same type of envelope sitting on top of the pile. It was almost identical to the first one, except the handwriting was slightly different, more rushed this time. I opened it, my hands shaking. You are being watched. The house is not yours to keep. I know where you sleep. I know what you do. I see everything. Don't try to run. My blood ran cold. This time, I didn't bother hiding the letter from the kids. Couldn't hide it. I needed to show Ben. I needed to figure out what to do. The thought that someone had been watching us, had been following us, it made my skin crawl. We hadn't even been here long enough to settle in properly. And now this? I thought back to the times when I'd felt uneasy. Those moments when I'd noticed something off, like the strange rustling in the bushes near the edge of our property, or the feeling of being watched when I was alone on the porch. But I had always shrugged it off, chalking it up to nerves or the weird sounds of an old house settling. But now it felt different, felt real. I waited until Ben came home that evening before I said anything. When he walked in, I handed him both letters, my fingers trembling. His face tightened as he read through them, and I saw the same unease spread across his face that I had felt earlier. This is insane, he muttered. Someone's playing a sick game. Or they're serious, I replied. Ben, I don't know what to do. Who's out there watching us? What do we do? Ben didn't say anything for a long time, just staring at the letters like he was trying to figure something out. Finally, he sighed. We'll call the police tomorrow, but for now, let's keep things normal. We can't panic. We don't even know if this person is real. But something in his voice told me that he was scared too, and I could see it in his eyes. He was just trying to stay calm for my sake, for the kids' sake. The days that followed were filled with dread. We tried to go about our normal lives, but everything felt off. Every time I walked outside, I half expected to see someone standing at the edge of the trees, watching us. The quietness of the house seemed heavier now. The wind sounded like whispers, and I could never shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Then came the third letter. It arrived on a Thursday morning, slipped under the door like the others. This one was different, though. It was longer, more detailed, and it was addressed to all of us. I see your children. I see the way they laugh and play. I see your wife as she walks in the yard, her hair blowing in the wind. I know when you are awake and I know when you sleep. I see the lights in your windows at night. I know everything about you. You are not safe. The house is mine. Don't forget that. I froze when I read it. I could hear my heart thumping in my chest, each beat sounding like it was in my ears. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. This person was not just watching us, they were studying us. They were paying attention to every move we made, every detail of our lives. My children, Ben, me. I immediately called the police, and the officer who answered seemed just as disturbed by the letter as we were. He promised to send someone out, but when they came, they didn't offer much help. They said they would take the letter and try to trace any handwriting or fingerprints, but they didn't seem hopeful. It felt like they were just going through the motions, trying to appease us. I couldn't shake the feeling that the person was still out there, watching us, waiting for the right moment. We started locking all the doors at night, keeping the blinds closed. I even began sleeping with a lamp on, just to feel like I wasn't in the dark. But it didn't help. One night, about a week after the third letter, I woke up to the sound of something tapping against my window. I froze, heart hammering in my chest. I lay there, perfectly still, straining to listen. It wasn't the wind, this was a definite rhythmic tapping. Slowly, I crept out of bed, not wanting to wake Ben. I tiptoed across the floor, careful not to make a sound, and peered out of the window. The night was dark, and I could barely make out the shape of the trees at the edge of the property. But there was nothing there. I sighed, feeling foolish, but as I was about to turn away, I noticed something strange. A shadow, no, a figure, was standing near the tree line, just standing there, motionless, as if they were waiting for something. I couldn't make out any details, just the outline of a person, and I quickly stepped back, heart racing. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I told Ben about what I had seen, but he didn't seem convinced. He thought it was probably just my mind playing tricks on me. I wanted to believe that too, but after that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was always out there, watching. Days turned into weeks, and the letters stopped coming. The police couldn't trace them. They couldn't find any evidence of anyone being on the property. And yet, we knew something was wrong. The watcher hadn't given up. We didn't know who they were or why they were doing this, but we couldn't ignore it anymore. We had to leave. We put the house up for sale and moved away out of Westfield, out of that house. As soon as we did, the fear lifted, though a part of me will never forget it. The feeling of being watched, the letters, the constant terror of wondering who was behind it all. In the end, we never found out who the watcher was. The mystery remains unsolved, but at least we're safe now. The house may have been beautiful, but it was never really ours. The watcher made sure of that. I walked into the lobby of the Stanley Hotel late in the evening, the grand entrance giving off a slightly eerie vibe despite its majestic architecture. I had read about this place before, how it was said to be the inspiration for Stephen King's The Shining. The stories of ghostly piano music echoing through empty hallways, the cold spots, the apparitions. All of that seemed far-fetched to me, but there was no denying the strange atmosphere that hung in the air. It wasn't just the hotel's history, but the way it seemed to draw out something unsettling from deep within the night. I had never believed in ghosts or anything supernatural, but there was something about the Stanley that made me uneasy. Maybe it was the hotel's age, or perhaps the unsettling silence that stretched through the lobby, broken only by the hum of a flickering light above. The staff, while polite and professional, had a strange stiffness about them, as if they were trying too hard to seem normal. The woman at the front desk checked me in without saying much, other than informing me that I had been assigned room 217. I tried to hide my nervousness as she handed me the key. I'd heard about room 217 before, supposedly it was notorious for its haunting. But I shook my head, dismissing the thought. There was no way I was going to let a room number or a few ghost stories scare me. I had stayed in older, more rundown places without a second thought. The walk to my room was long, the hallway dark and narrow, lit by dim sconces that cast flickering shadows on the carpet. The wallpaper was faded, peeling in places, and the whole place smelled faintly of mildew. It looked like something straight out of a vintage horror film, the kind of setting where something sinister was always lurking just out of sight. When I finally reached room 217, I hesitated for a moment before unlocking the door. Inside, the room was large but sparsely furnished. A big, four-poster bed sat against one wall, with a heavy quilt draped over it. There was an old dresser with a cracked mirror, a wooden chair in the corner, and a faded rug that seemed to swallow the sound of my footsteps as I walked across the floor. The room had a musty smell, the kind of stale air you get in places that haven't been used in a while. I placed my bag on the bed and went to the window. The view overlooked the hotel's sprawling grounds, the mountains in the distance shrouded by a veil of fog. The wind howled through the trees outside, and I couldn't help but wonder how many people had stayed in this room before me. The thought lingered in my mind for a moment, but I quickly pushed it aside. I wasn't here for the ghost stories. I was here to get some rest and maybe snap a few pictures of the old hotel in the morning. The evening wore on, and I settled into the bed, trying to ignore the cold draft that seemed to seep in through the cracks around the window. I pulled the covers tighter around me and closed my eyes, thinking I'd drift off to sleep quickly. But sleep didn't come as easily as I had hoped. The room seemed unnervingly quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears and makes every small sound stand out. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint creaks and groans of the old building settling. For a while, I told myself it was just the wind outside, or maybe the hotel's age making those sounds. But then I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like a piano key being struck. I froze, unsure if I was imagining it. It came again, followed by a slow, haunting melody that seemed to drift through the walls. My first thought was that it was a radio, or maybe some noise from another guest's room. But then the music continued, clear and deliberate, as if someone was playing it right outside my door. I got up from the bed, my heart pounding in my chest. I stood still for a moment, straining to listen, but the music stopped abruptly, leaving only silence behind. I waited, thinking it might be a trick of my mind, but the silence stretched on. The hotel felt unnaturally still, like it was holding its breath. I went back to bed, trying to shake off the feeling that something was off, but I couldn't. My mind raced with thoughts of the piano music. Was it real? Was it just my imagination? The longer I lay there, the more the feeling of unease grew, until it became unbearable. I decided to check the hallway, just to see if anyone else was up, or if there was a logical explanation for what I had heard. I grabbed my jacket and opened the door. The hallway was empty, bathed in the soft glow of the overhead lights. I stepped out, the sound of my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. I walked down the corridor, passing by a series of closed doors, each one just as silent as the last. There was no sign of anyone else, no indication that anyone had been awake at all. It was just me and the quiet, unnerving stillness of the hotel. As I stood there, I felt the temperature drop noticeably, a sudden chill that seemed to seep into my bones. I rubbed my arms to ward off the cold, but it only seemed to intensify. It wasn't just the cold, though. It was the feeling that something wasn't right, that I wasn't alone. I turned back and walked toward my room, the hallway stretching before me like an endless tunnel. As I reached my door, I froze. There, just ahead of me, was a figure standing in the shadows. I couldn't make out any details at first, but I could see the outline of a person, standing still and unmoving. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze in place, unable to look away. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there in the dim light, as if it were waiting for me to approach. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. I wanted to scream, but my voice was stuck in my throat. I stared at the figure, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure disappeared into the shadows, vanishing without a trace. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the blood rushing in my ears. But there was no sign of the figure anymore, no trace of anything out of the ordinary. I backed into my room, locking the door behind me. I didn't care about the piano music anymore. I didn't care about the ghost stories or the rumors. I just wanted to be alone in that room, away from whatever I had seen in the hallway. The rest of the night passed in a blur of restless tossing and turning. Every creak, every gust of wind outside made me jump. Every sound seemed to carry a weight, as if something was lurking just out of sight. I didn't sleep a wink, just staring at the ceiling and waiting for the morning light. When morning finally came, I couldn't get out of that room fast enough. I packed my things quickly, almost throwing them into my bag without care. I didn't want to look around the room, didn't want to see anything that would remind me of the night I had just spent there. As I left the Stanley Hotel, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the hotel's front lawn. The air was crisp and fresh, and for a moment, I thought maybe I had imagined everything. Maybe the music, the figure, the cold. All of it had been a figment of my imagination, born from the hotel's reputation and my own unease. But as I looked back at the grand building, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching me, that whatever had happened inside that hotel was far from over. The door slammed shut behind me as I stepped outside, and the last thing I heard before I drove away was the soft, eerie echo of piano music, faint but unmistakable, drifting on the wind. I didn't look back, and I never will. The farmhouse was eerie from the moment I saw it, perched on a quiet hill surrounded by dense trees. You could tell it had stood there for a long time, maybe longer than it was supposed to. I had heard all the stories. Everyone had. They said the place was haunted, that bad things had happened there, things that left a mark on the house. But to me, it was just another old building in a long history of old buildings, until I found myself standing in front of it one chilly afternoon. I was a part of a small group, not more than 5 of us, tasked with investigating the house. None of us were experts, but we all had an interest in the supernatural, or maybe it was just curiosity that led us to this place. Whatever it was, we were ready to dive into whatever lay within those old, creaking walls. We got there just before sunset. The house was exactly how I had imagined. A rambling farmhouse, faded white paint, broken windows, and a sense of abandonment hanging in the air like a thick fog. The grounds were overgrown, with weeds and wild grass swallowing up the stone steps leading up to the front door. As we approached, I noticed the house looked like it was holding its breath, waiting for something. The farmhouse had a reputation. They said things happened there that were hard to explain. Motion detectors went off without cause, lights flickered and shut off on their own, and there were stories about furniture moving around in the dead of night. It was the kind of place that, if you walked in at night, you wouldn't be sure whether to laugh or run. But we weren't running. Not yet. We made our way inside after breaking through the old lock on the front door. It creaked loudly as it opened, echoing through the empty house. The air inside was heavy, thick with the scent of dust and something I couldn't quite place. The floors groaned under our weight as we shuffled inside. The place was barren, save for a few old pieces of furniture, most of them covered with dusty sheets. There was a strange silence in the air, a silence that felt almost too loud. We set up our gear, motion detectors, cameras, and the usual equipment used for these types of investigations. None of us said much. The house felt off, too quiet, too still. I started to feel the weight of the stories people had told me about the place. The disappearances, the strange happenings, the families who had lived there before they all seemed to vanish into thin air. But still, we pressed on. We spent the first few hours exploring the lower floor. The kitchen was the first room that felt wrong to me. The cabinets were falling apart, doors hanging on rusted hinges, and the floor tiles were cracked and uneven. But what stood out the most were the motion detectors. They went off for no reason. Not once, but multiple times. I would swear the thing was malfunctioning, but every time we checked, there was nothing there. We would turn the detectors off, only for them to go off again minutes later, and we were the only ones in the house. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the old wiring was causing it. Maybe a breeze from the cracked windows was setting them off. But something told me it wasn't that simple. The house felt alive in a way, not in the sense that people lived there, but in the way the air around you shifts when you're being watched. The longer we stayed, the more I started noticing strange things. In the parlor, the shadows didn't quite match up with the light. They moved in odd directions, as if they were independent of the light sources casting them. I could feel something pressing in on me, a weight that wasn't there before. But every time I tried to focus on it, the sensation slipped away like a half-remembered dream. I wasn't the only one to feel it. One of the others, a woman named Linda, started to feel a tightness in her chest. Her breath became shallow, and her face grew pale. She said it was as if the house was trying to choke the air out of her. We made our way upstairs after a few hours. The second floor was even worse, if that was possible. The air was thick and oppressive. The walls were peeling, the paint chipped away in large swaths. But the real kicker was the furniture. The chairs in the corner of the room weren't placed the way they had been when we first entered. The couch, which had been upright earlier, was now tipped over on its side. It wasn't just a small shift. It was as though something had deliberately moved it. At that point, we were starting to second-guess ourselves. Were we just imagining things? Was the house playing tricks on us? But I knew better than that. The feeling of being watched, the unexplainable movements, it wasn't something you could just dismiss. We decided to split up to cover more ground. I stayed in one of the upstairs bedrooms, sitting in front of a window that overlooked the overgrown yard. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields. I tried to focus on the outside, on the calm of the woods beyond the house, but I kept hearing things. The house seemed to settle under its own weight, creaking and groaning like it was trying to speak to us. I caught a flash of movement in the corner of my eye. It was fast, just a brief shadow crossing the yard, and when I turned my head to look, there was nothing. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, or perhaps a fox or a deer in the distance. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, something I couldn't see, but it was watching me. The night dragged on. We reconvened in the living room, gathering around the old fireplace, trying to piece together what we'd seen and heard. There was no mistaking it anymore. The house wasn't empty. Something was here. But what? It wasn't until later that night, when we were sitting in the dark, the only light coming from our equipment, that the house decided to make itself known. The motion detectors went off as they had before, but this time the lights in the living room flickered, then went out entirely. The air grew cold, uncomfortably so, and I could hear my heart pounding in my chest. My breath came out in visible clouds. We all froze. The silence that followed was deafening. The feeling in the room was suffocating, like the walls were closing in. I don't know what happened next. It's hard to explain. A sudden crash from above startled us. Something heavy fell upstairs. The sound of it tumbling down the stairs echoed throughout the house. We rushed up to investigate, the whole group now on edge, but there was nothing there. I felt a strange compulsion to go into the attic. It was an instinct I couldn't explain, a pull, like something was waiting for me. I couldn't ignore it, so I started up the narrow staircase, the others trailing behind me, their footsteps soft against the old wood. The attic was small, cluttered with old boxes and forgotten belongings. There was an old rocking chair in the corner, its wood darkened with age. I stood there for a moment, staring at it. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of mothballs was so strong it made me gag. Then it happened. The chair moved, slowly, creaking against the floorboards, as though someone was sitting in it. I watched, paralyzed, as it rocked back and forth, the movement steady and deliberate. I turned to the others, but when I looked back at the chair, it stopped. Just like that, it was still. The rest of the group seemed to have had enough. We agreed to pack up and leave. As we descended the stairs, I felt a sense of relief. The house wasn't going to get the best of us. We'd made it through and we were getting out. But as I reached the front door, I looked back at the house one last time. It wasn't just the house that felt wrong. It was the land around it, the trees, the wind. It all felt like it was holding its breath, waiting. The house might have been empty, but something about the place made it clear that it was never truly abandoned. We left the farmhouse that night, driving down the long, winding road as fast as we could. The air outside felt different, fresher, like we'd left something behind, something we couldn't understand but knew better than to question. We never went back, and I don't think I ever will. There are things you can't explain, things that go beyond simple logic and reason. I've come to realize that some places are best left alone, even if they don't have ghosts or monsters lurking in the dark. Some places are just wrong. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend. I'd rented this secluded cabin tucked away in the woods, miles from the nearest neighbor. I needed the solitude, the quiet, to finish a project I'd been working on for weeks. As a writer, I often found inspiration in isolation, and this cabin promised just that. A chance to be alone with my thoughts. The road leading up to the cabin was a rough, gravel path, barely wide enough for my car to pass through. I drove cautiously, the tires kicking up stones as I made my way toward the place I'd chosen for some peace and quiet. The trees on either side grew thick and dense, their branches reaching over the road, casting long shadows over the path as the sun began to set. I'd arrived later than planned, so by the time I reached the cabin, darkness was already creeping in. The cabin itself was charming in an old-fashioned way, small, wooden, and weathered by time. The kind of place that might have been built decades ago, maybe even a century. It had a cozy feel, with a stone fireplace, heavy wooden beams above, and old-fashioned furniture that seemed to have been here since the cabin was built. The place was perfect for what I needed, and I felt a sense of relief as I unlocked the door and stepped inside. I spent the first few hours settling in. I unpacked my things, set up my laptop on the small wooden desk by the window, and cracked open a bottle of bourbon I'd brought with me. The fire in the hearth crackled, casting a warm glow on the room. It was peaceful, quiet, the kind of silence you can only find in places where no one else is for miles. The perfect environment to focus. But as the night wore on, something began to feel off. It started with the wind chimes. The cabin didn't have them when I first arrived, but sometime after I'd lit the fire, a soft tinkling sound filled the air, like the lightest breeze brushing against metal. I froze for a second, listening. There was no breeze outside. The trees were still, and the air was thick with the kind of stillness that only happens in the deep woods. But the chimes kept ringing. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was probably just something I hadn't noticed when I first entered. Maybe the cabin's owner had them hanging somewhere, and I'd missed them. Either way, it wasn't enough to be concerned about. But then, there was a flash of light. Out of nowhere, the room lit up like someone had thrown a spotlight across the cabin. It was so sudden and bright that I flinched, nearly knocking my drink over. I stared around, my heart racing for a few beats, expecting to see something through the window, maybe headlights from another car, but there was nothing. The woods were silent and dark, the firelight the only source of illumination. I pushed my confusion aside and tried to focus again on the work in front of me. But it wasn't long before I heard it. Soft at first, but unmistakable. Ticking sound. It was like an old clock ticking away somewhere, but I couldn't find the source. I turned in my chair, peering into the shadows of the room, but there was nothing. I even checked the kitchen, thinking maybe the old stove was making the noise, but everything was quiet. Still, the ticking continued, just faintly in the background, and it grew more and more distracting. It felt like the sound was coming from the walls themselves, but I was in a secluded cabin in the middle of nowhere. There was no clock, no electronics, no reason for this noise. Then came the first strange sound from outside, the sound of something scraping against the side of the cabin. My skin prickled with unease, and I stood up quickly, walking toward the window and peering out into the darkness. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, but nothing seemed out of place. I squinted into the night, trying to make sense of the sound. Then, as I was about to turn away, I saw it, a shadow, tall and looming, moving just outside the window. My heart skipped a beat. I stepped back, holding my breath, trying to focus. The shadow wasn't moving like a person. It was slow, deliberate, almost like it was searching for something. I pressed my hand to the cold glass, squinting harder, and the shadow seemed to pause. It stood still, just outside the range of my view, hidden by the thick darkness beyond the cabin. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? But who would even come all the way out here in the middle of nowhere? I didn't want to take my eyes off the shadow, but after a minute or so, it seemed to drift away, slowly, silently, as though it was never there. But that didn't put me at ease. If anything, it made my nerves worse. I couldn't focus on my work anymore. The ticking sound had stopped, but the unease lingered. The wind chimes still chimed in the background, eerily persistent. I decided to get some air. Maybe walking outside for a minute would help me clear my head. I grabbed my jacket and stepped out the door, the cool night air hitting me as I walked down the creaky porch steps. As I stood there, listening to the quiet hum of the woods around me, the wind chimes stopped. It was so sudden that it almost felt like the world had gone completely still. The silence that followed was so deep, so profound, that I could almost hear the beat of my own heart. I looked up into the dark sky, trying to calm my racing thoughts, when I heard a sound again, this time unmistakable. A low growl. My blood ran cold. A bear, I thought. That's what it had to be. I turned quickly to go back inside, but something stopped me. A dark shape, just at the edge of the porch, barely visible in the low light. The outline of something large and solid. A bear. It had to be, but I couldn't move. My feet were frozen to the floorboards as I stared at the shape, the silhouette of a massive animal just beyond the door. I could feel my pulse pounding in my throat, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Then I heard it, the rattle of the doorknob. I rushed back toward the door, fumbling with the handle, my hands trembling. The knob was loose, almost as if it were broken. I twisted it, yanked at it, but the door wouldn't open. I slammed my shoulder into it, but it didn't budge. The bear, or whatever it was still out there, the sound of its breathing heavy and slow. I could hear its claws scraping against the wood, and I realized that if I didn't get inside, I might not make it. My heart was in my throat as I backed away from the door, grabbing my phone from my pocket. I didn't know what good it would do out here with no reception, but I had to try something. But just as I raised it to dial, I heard another noise, a rustling in the bushes near the cabin, followed by the unmistakable sound of something large crashing through the underbrush. I was trapped. The windows were too high for me to escape through, and the back door was stuck. I'd been so focused on the front that I hadn't even thought to check the back of the cabin when I arrived. I was about to panic when I heard something even worse. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from inside the cabin. The same ticking sound, but now it wasn't in the walls. It was in the hall behind me, coming closer. I turned around, but there was nothing. Nothing but darkness. I grabbed the nearest thing, a chair, and held it in front of me as if it could protect me from whatever was coming. My thoughts were racing now. What was happening? Who was inside? But then, just as suddenly as it had all started, the ticking stopped. The sounds outside stopped. The shadows vanished. I stood there for what felt like hours, unable to move, unable to breathe. My eyes darted around the room, looking for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. It was as if everything had stopped. The woods outside, the house, all of it, silent. I took a shaky breath and moved slowly to the door, my hands still gripping the chair. When I twisted the doorknob again, this time it opened. I didn't wait. I stepped outside, into the cool night air, and bolted to my car without looking back. I left the cabin behind, drove away through the winding road, and didn't stop until I was miles away, the uneasy feeling still crawling beneath my skin. Later, I would learn that the cabin had been abandoned for years. There were no owners listed. It had been marked for demolition, though it wasn't clear why. Some stories said it had been a hunting lodge, but no one had stayed there for decades. It was as if something real and unsettling, had been waiting for someone to come, and I would never return to that cabin, no matter how quiet it seemed. I've always been the kind of person to take an adventure for what it is. No frills, no fairy tales. Just a day's hike, a good story, and a quiet night under the stars. But when I decided to visit Bronco's cabin in Tombstone, Arizona, I was expecting just another stop on my way through the desert. I'd heard rumors, sure. Stories of strange noises, mysterious deaths, and ghost sightings, but I didn't believe in any of that. I thought it was just another old place with some dark history tacked on. But what I encountered there wasn't anything out of a ghost story. It was something much worse. The weight of human violence, the echo of a tragic history, and a reminder that not all places are meant to be remembered. I had read the history of the place. Built in 1858, Bronco's cabin stood as one of the oldest structures in the area, its history grim and marred by deaths that spanned decades. Frederick Bronco and his companions had been found dead under mysterious circumstances in 1860, and since then, the cabin had been linked to more than 20 deaths. Something about the place had drawn people to it, and not just for the mining. There was a darkness about it, an aura of violence that had never fully left. I arrived in the area late in the afternoon, the sun already sinking low and casting long shadows across the desert. The drive out to the cabin had been more rugged than I expected, with the trail getting increasingly sparse the further I went. By the time I parked my truck and walked toward the cabin, the last of the daylight was slipping away. The wind picked up, stirring the dry earth, carrying with it the smell of dust and something more unsettling. The cabin itself looked just like the pictures I'd seen. The wood was weathered and cracked, the stone foundation still solid. It stood in a clearing, surrounded by scrub and prickly pear cactus. There was a sense of stillness around it, but not the peaceful kind. It felt as though the land was holding its breath, waiting. I took a moment to look around. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the sky was painted in shades of purple and orange. I couldn't help but feel the weight of the history that clung to this place, the weight of all those lives lost. I knew better than to linger too long at places like this. The stories of ghostly mining sounds and strange apparitions that visitors had reported seemed like the sort of thing people would make up for attention or thrill. Still, a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened here, something that went beyond mere death. As I stepped closer to the cabin, I noticed the silence. Not just the kind of quiet you expect in the desert, but a thick, oppressive silence. Even the wind seemed to have paused. I pushed the creaking door open and stepped inside. The cabin smelled old, musty, like stale air and earth. The interior was simple, with rough-hewn beams overhead and the remnants of a fireplace along one wall. The furniture, what was left of it, was sparse. A broken chair, a few scraps of wood scattered on the floor. I was standing in a place where lives had been lived and lives had been lost. But nothing about it felt haunted in the traditional sense. No cold drafts, no flickering lights, no strange sensations. I set my bag down on the floor and pulled out my flashlight, scanning the room. It was clear that the place hadn't been maintained in years, if not decades. There were pieces of old tools scattered about, rusted and forgotten. A few signs of previous visitors, but no one had been here for a while. The only sound was the distant call of a coyote and the soft rustling of the wind outside. I sat down on the floor, letting the silence settle around me. As I looked around, I could almost feel the presence of the past. The rough way the cabin had been built, the crude tools left behind, the remnants of whatever had gone wrong here. It all seemed to speak of something that couldn't be put to rest. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, a tapping, almost like the sound of pickaxes hitting stone, echoing from somewhere deep in the earth. I froze, my heart picking up speed. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe the building settling. But it sounded so real, so deliberate, so close. I stood up, my legs shaky, and walked toward the back of the cabin. The tapping grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't coming from the walls, though. It was coming from the ground. My flashlight flickered as I reached the far corner, where a stone slab lay partially uncovered by the dirt floor. Without thinking, I knelt down and pushed the slab aside, revealing a narrow opening beneath. My hand trembled as I peered into the darkness. I couldn't explain why, but something pulled me toward it, something that whispered that I needed to see what lay beneath the cabin, beneath the history. I slid into the hole, the space tight and claustrophobic, but I couldn't stop myself. The air down here was cool and stale, thick with the smell of earth and rot. My flashlight's beam revealed a narrow tunnel, leading off into the darkness. The tapping was louder now, almost rhythmic, as if something or someone was down there. I didn't hesitate. I crawled forward, my body scraping along the rough tunnel walls. The sound was deafening now, like 1,000 pickaxes working in unison. And then I saw it, the glint of metal in the dim light. I reached for it, my hand trembling, and pulled it out. A rusted mining tool, half buried in the dirt, and next to it something more, bones. My heart raced as I scrambled backward, the weight of what I had found crashing over me. I knew what this meant. The cabin hadn't just been a place of death. It had been a place of violence, of people trying to escape something, and in the end, being consumed by it. I didn't stay long after that. My feet were unsteady as I climbed back up through the hole and out into the open air. The tapping had stopped, but the silence that followed was even more oppressive. The wind had picked up again, but it did nothing to ease the sense of dread that hung in the air. As I walked back to my truck, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't a ghost I feared. It was the history of the place, the brutality, the fear, the sense of unfinished business that lingered in the bones of the earth. I couldn't explain what had happened here, but I knew that it wasn't over. Not for the people who had died, and not for anyone who came here looking for answers. I left Tombstone that night, the road ahead dark and endless. The desert stretched out before me, vast and empty. But I couldn't forget what I had seen, what I had uncovered beneath the surface. The cabin, the mine, the lives lost in that unforgiving land. None of it had been buried, not really. It was still there, beneath the earth, waiting to be remembered. And as I drove away, I couldn't help but wonder how many more people had come to the cabin, looking for a story, only to find something far worse. In the end, I realized that Bronco's cabin wasn't haunted by ghosts. It was haunted by the weight of its past, the violence and death that had taken place within its walls. And no matter how many years had passed, no matter how many people came and went, that history would never let go. It would never be buried. Not truly.